With these words, Hector stirred in every heart courage and eagerness to fight, as when a hunter sets his white-toothed hounds to rush against a lion or wild boar. Just so the son of Priam set the valiant Trojans against the Greeks, and he himself, like Ares, destroyer of humanity, ran out among the frontline fighters full of daring. That was from the Iliad by Homer. You are listening to Hot Takes from the Classics, your gossipy gallop through the very best books ever written. My name is Tim McIntosh. I am joined by Emily Maeda, and you've joined us for episode 1, season 1 of this podcast. Let me say something before I bring Emily on about the way that we're thinking about seasons on this podcast. We have grouped each season around a theme, and this season's theme is war. We're going to start in the ancient world with the Iliad, but we're going to move chronologically through the centuries and hopefully put these books in conversation with each other, because war is going to change throughout the centuries, as you would expect. Emily, Homer's Iliad is one of the biggest of the great classics, and it is a bloody book. It is a warful book, and it begins, as many conflicts have begun, with a dispute over a woman.
So true.
Right?
Thousands of years ago. So, Tim, if Helen is the face that launched 1,000 ships, then is the Iliad a poem that has launched thousands of books?
That's very good, Emily. That's very good.
So Homer did not write that line, but it's often said that Helen is the face that launched 1,000 ships. It's actually Christopher Marlowe who says that, surprisingly.
A contemporary of Shakespeare.
Exactly. But it just goes to illustrate the point that this book has woven its way into the history of the Western civilization. We can't get away from it. We have to talk.
And we don't want to get away from it either.
What's that?
I said, we don't want to get away from the Iliad. The Iliad is just incredible.
Well, does everybody feel that way? It is incredible. But of Homer's 2 poems, I think sometimes people feel a little bit more kinship with the Odyssey than they do with the Iliad.
Do you think it's because the Iliad is so bloody?
I think so.
Yeah.
It's so incredibly bloody.
Yeah.
So incredibly bloody. But it is. I mean, just in this reread, I was like, this is so great. I don't know if I'm just weird, but like the battles, so great. It's so bloody. I don't know. Maybe that makes me weird, but
it does make you wonder. I remember reading this with students and like kind of looking around the table at each other thinking, why are we glorying so much in this disgusting depiction of like a man's throat being slit and purple gore spewing forth? Like what? And part of it is because it is just beautiful writing. I mean,
it is
beautiful.
It is. Well, I was going to start just with a bit of a personal anecdote, my relationship to this book. So I've read numerous different translations and counts because this has been rewritten in all sorts of forms. But one of the funnest things that is funnest a word? Yeah, I think it is. Is it a word? Whenever I say funnest, it always sounds funny. Anyway, a rite of passage in our family is for each child to take their position. Who is better, Hector or Achilles?
Okay, nice.
Tales that each child who starts to have a relationship with this book has a position on this and argues it firmly. And it actually is the launching point for my husband to start wanting to read more of the classics, because he heard this back and forth, who's better? And he thought, I don't know who these people are. I don't know who they're talking about. So if you have ever read the Iliad or wanted to read the Iliad, maybe Mark's experience makes you feel better. Because, first of all, he got the audiobook, Fagel's translation, and he listened.
Nice.
And he said, I cannot understand this. So then I said, well, try Black Ships Before Troy, which is by Rosemary Sutcliffe. He tried that. He's like, I sort of got it, not really. Then our friends had a graphic novel of it. And they said, oh, we'll try this, a graphic novel by Gareth Hines. And he read that and he said, I get it. So, I mean, I think you know probably, Tim, why some of those reasons are. I mean, some of the reasons that make the Iliad difficult to enter into. Thoughts?
The language can be really strange if you don't. Sometimes the translators do a really good job of making the language very, very approachable, but sometimes they like to keep the language really heightened, and maybe formal is not the right word, but grand.
Yes.
And so that's, we're not, when we pick up the Iliad to read it, we're not reading Homer's original text. Of course, we're reading a translation, probably in English. If you're listening to this, you're probably would read it in English. And kind of first decision to make is the one that you just discussed. What translator are you going to choose? It's a big decision.
Well, and it's a controversial decision, is it not?
It is.
People have very strong feelings about this. I am sure we'll have all sorts of hate mail about this. And so there are some different translations that I think it's important to know this before you try to start reading it. There are two old ones that some people have undying affection for, by Lattimore and Fitzgerald. And they both really do emphasize sort of that grandness.
Yeah.
But they are somewhat archaic. They're a little bit hard to enter into. Now, I know people are going to be really mad that I just said that. It's okay. You can be mad. Next translation, Fagles. I actually really like the Fagles translation.
I do too.
Really like the Fagles translation. I think he does an amazing job. And last but not least is a new one that just came out by Emily Wilson. And that is what I read half of this in. And I would say, if you've read any reviews of it, she writes it for its punchiness and applicability to people now. So
that one's going to be easier to get into.
I think it is. She has interesting, and that's one of the fun things. If you want to compare translations, you can. She calls Hector and Achilles, there's a certain word, and I obviously don't know the Greek word, but she translates it shepherd of the people. Fagles translates it great commander. So interesting to get that sort of difference between the translations. So yeah, I think translation is one thing. I think another thing that's very difficult are all the names.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Right.
How do you keep them straight in your mind?
I have experienced some of the other books that are considered classics. If I really need to know them, I do a chart on like back inside flap.
Yeah.
I write like a kind of like family tree and the main characters, and I cheat. I go to Spark Notes and cheat, like who are going to be my main characters? Okay, Agamemnon. Okay, Achilles. I write their names larger, and I write kind of like the subsidiary characters, in relation to them. Are they on the Greek side or are they on the Trojan side? So I cheat. Oh, I don't even know that's cheating. Maybe that's just good practice.
That's being a good reader.
Right, there we go.
I think for Mark that was a lot of his hang up was, who are these people? Who are they? And
right.
Them straight. So I'm going to give you a little rundown. You can do that. So
I love it.
Keep these names straight, because it is true that foreignness makes it hard to enter into. I think another thing is that it's written in poetry. This is a poem. And you kind of have to enter the mind of the ancient world to sort of get into it. We are prose thinkers. We want things fast and we want them data-driven.
Plain. Yep.
Right? Analytically.
Yep.
And this is not that. This is dwelling in the beauty of imagery. It's dwelling in the beauty of words. It's dwelling in the beauty of description. And so when you're reading it, you have to enter that world. I would like to put in the show notes a great essay by Dana Gioia on why poetry is important, because I think a lot of people can think he should have just told us what happened. Well, it didn't have any of the impact.
Right.
He just told us what happened.
We wouldn't still be reading it if he just told us what happened.
Exactly. We would have forgotten it. So Tim, what you read at the beginning was an
epic simile.
nice one. I didn't even say you were going to say that. It's perfect. It's an epic
good.
simile. And you have to sort of love the epic simile. You've got to love it because he is doing that all throughout. And they're always metaphors from the natural world, right? Always metaphors from the natural world. We don't do that generally. We generally have metaphors from machines. I don't know. We are much less connected to the natural world than these people were.
Yeah. I just want to remind people, I think like most listeners are going to remember this. A simile is a kind of descriptive clause that begins with one of two words, as or like. So here, Hector stirred in every heart courage and eagerness to fight, as when a hunter sets his white-toothed hounds. So it's a simile. Emily, do you understand why it's called an epic simile? It's not just because it's like super long.
Because it's highlighting the grandness of the heroic nature. Can I read you my favorite one?
Yeah, please.
Even have you start, but then you can hear what Tim just said. Achilles, son of Peleus, confronted him and pounced like a devouring lion, whom the people from all around are desperate to kill. They gather to confront him, but the lion ignores them and continues on his way till one of the young warriors attacks and hits him with a spear. He crouches low, jaws open, and foam frothing on his teeth. His brave heart groans, and with his tail he lashes his flanks from side to side and goads himself to battle, and with eyes ablaze, he hurtles straight at the enemy to kill some man, or else be killed himself amid the fray. Just so Achilles' bold, intrepid spirit goaded him forward to come face to face with valiant Aeneas. So it has both of those qualities. It is very long, and it is also about the heroic nature of the...
Yeah. I mean, just that, Emily, that little snippet that you gave us, that whets my appetite again for the Iliad. It's so powerful. It's so hard charging. It's always moving forward. And 9 out of 10 times it's moving forward toward conflict.
Exactly.
Conflict. The whole book is conflict.
But when you read those, or you read the speeches from a Hector or Ajax, you're like, yes.
Yeah.
So with all of that, how about I now give you a summary?
I would love to hear it.
I mean, here's the summary. Ready?
I'm ready.
People fight and they die. There's the summary.
Yeah.
Kidding, but not really. That's what happens. Why sometimes people are like, well, what's the point? But you have to, I think part of the joy of this poem is riding the waves of these images and metaphors, and it's riding the waves and it's living in that world, So I would just encourage you, if you can, to do that. Okay, so one of the things that happens in the retellings is you can often start at the chronologically beginning point, which is what we also really like. But this poem doesn't start there. It starts in media res. Okay, that you want to?
What does that mean?
Oh,
what does in media res mean?
In the middle of things. Flat.
Yes.
In the middle of things. So it starts in the middle of things. It starts 9 years into this darn war that's been fought. 9 years between the Greeks and the Trojans. Over whom?
Helen, the face who launched 1,000 ships.
And the backstory is that Paris, a son of Troy, gets roped into a goddess conflict, and he chooses Aphrodite as the most fair of all the goddesses, and she gives him the most beautiful woman on earth, who is Helen. Only problem is, Helen, she's already spoken for.
She's already spoken for.
Who is she married to? Menelaus. See, there's a lot of names.
There's so many names. I need a chart. Already.
Oh, Lord. Okay, so Helen gets stolen. The Greeks, led by Agamemnon, who is the king of the Greeks, but the Greeks are just a loose association of sort of tribal warlords. So he is brother to Menelaus, and the two of them rouse the Greeks. The Greeks sail for Troy, and they start fighting. But you don't know all of this when you...
Right.
You don't know all of this. So that's another reason that you get thrown off, because you don't get this story at the beginning.
It's funny. Sorry to interrupt, Emily, but like if we were ancient Greeks, the backstory of the Iliad would be on all of our hearts. We would all know it. It would be,
Exactly.
It would have been told and retold around the campfire hundreds of times.
Exactly.
But modern American readers, you're right. We step into it and we're like, wait, who? Wait, what? Who's fighting who? And what's the fight about?
Yeah, who's fighting who? Because at the beginning, it's Achilles, the rage of Achilles, leading him to leave the Greeks because Agamemnon has stolen his war trophy. Okay, a little upsetting. The war trophy to Briseis, a woman. So women are quite, on the one hand, objectified in this poem a little bit. She's a war trophy.
Just a little bit, right.
Okay. So
I do want to say, I mean, you're probably going to get to this, but
yeah.
What Achilles is so upset about, it's a little bit about the woman. It is all about his honor.
Exactly.
Honor is the thing that is running everywhere in the background of this novel. And I think that like American society in the 21st century is a low honor culture, unlike, say, Japanese culture in the earlier part of the 20th century is a high honor society. I think, like, I'm from the American South, and I think as recent as 2 generations ago, we were probably like a mid to high honor culture. But we've got to remember that, like, my standing in society, my honor is of utmost and crucial importance to me all the time. And to have my war bride taken from me, it's hardly about her. It is everything about the insult to my honor.
Totally. Yeah. No, he says that he loves Briseis, but yeah, it's his honor that's at stake. And that is such a good point, because I think a lot of times that's another hard entrance point is people are like, you're fighting over a woman, but of course they're actually not fighting over Helen in life.
Right.
They're fighting over the fact that Paris dishonored Menelaus, right? I mean, so yeah, that sense of honor and winning glory. I mean, Achilles gives up immortality to win glory, right?
Yeah.
So this is a shift in the way that we have to think like an ancient is to hold that in high regard. So
yes, right.
Okay, so they've been fighting for 9 years, and who are our major players? Well, we've got Odysseus, we've got Ajax. Now, here's something confusing, because we don't just have one Ajax, we've got 2 Ajax. Yes. We've got Menelaus, who is the scorned husband. We've got Agamemnon, who is the head of the Greeks. But remember, they're all sort of independent. They're independent contractors. They're not.
Yeah, right.
They're all, and that's the deal with Achilles. Achilles is an independent contractor, and he says, I'm not going to fight anymore because you've dishonored me. We also have Patroclus, who, oh my gosh, do you love Patroclus?
I do.
I feel in this reading, he is the most human of all of these. Maybe Odysseus too, but Patroclus. We also have Nestor, who is the old and wise one. So those are major players. Of course, there's a lot of others, but those are the major players. For the Trojans, we have the king of the Trojans, who's Priam. And Priam has many sons, but chief among his sons is Hector. And then Paris, who's kind of, honestly, a screw-up. Is he not?
He is a screw-up.
He's a screw-up. So we also have the king of the Sarpedons. We've got some other players, but, Hector really does lead much of what happens with the Trojans.
Hector. I want to go back, Emily, to something that you said about independent contractor, because that's a great way of describing these main characters that we're meeting in the Iliad. So again, I'm thinking about like modern day warfare is so different. Modern day warfare, we have men and women sign up to be part of the armed forces, and they are from towns and cities all over the United States, but they're part of one massive fighting force, or like one of the big...
Exactly. The state. The state.
The state, that's right. The state is running it. So the state is a centralized political body. Well, there's not really anything like that in Greece and Troy at this time. What we've got is a kind of tapestry of different tribes.
Exactly.
And there are kings or warlords that are the heads of all of these tribes, and they have gotten together. They have pooled their resources and pooled their manpower and their weaponry and their ships together for a common cause. But because they're tribes, because they're not all centralized under one unifying political body, there's constant threat of tension and warfare between the tribes and tribes leaders.
Between the sides.
Yeah, right,
Yes,
right.
between the sides. So it's not even against the bitter enemy, it's on the sides. Okay, so now we have another complicating factor in this poem, which are the gods. The gods are complicating. And the gods are so changeable and so unpredictable. But you have gods sort of roughly lined up on two sides. And so this is another thing that makes it very confusing, which if you were an ancient person, it would not be confusing because this would be the air you breathed. But we've got Hera, wife of Zeus. We've got Poseidon, god of the sea. We've got Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Hephaestus, the god of the hearth. They're roughly lined up for the Greeks. For the Trojans, Apollo is their big friend, as so is Aphrodite. And for most of it, so is Zeus. But Zeus himself is horribly changeable. And Zeus is pictured holding scales for destiny or fate. And, you know, whoever's destiny or fate kind of comes out, that's who he goes against. So at one point, he holds up Hector. But on the other side, then he says, no, Hector's time has come and Achilles is going to kill him. So the gods are a complicating factor. Most of the time, Poseidon helps the Greeks. And at some point, he feels sorry for the Trojans and he goes in and helps the Trojans. So this is also...
So another thing that I think is very, very foreign to a modern reader is not just polytheism as a religious practice, polytheism as a sort of backdrop to the entire structure and arrangement of the world. Meaning, the gods are kind of operating at their own whims, passions, desires.
Exactly.
And so if one god is angry at the Trojans, well, that god has the liberty to like cast down a tornado upon them. And another god who is, you know, against the Greeks can do the same thing, can, you know, cause a terrible drought to overcome the Greeks. So nature is unstable. And the way that you get a stable natural world is to make sure that the gods are happy through sacrifice, through appeasement and things like this. But I mean, again, like in the modern world, speaking broadly, but I think accurately, you've got basically two religious choices, monotheism and atheism in the Western world. Those are like basically your two choices. You might have...
Default operating system.
That's right. That's the opposite. Not so in the ancient world. In fact, monotheism would be an absolute minority report at this time. It's all about polytheism. And part of the backdrop of this book is the natural world is chaotic, and who's going to win doesn't depend on who has the largest army, doesn't depend on who has the better weapons. It depends on who has more gods aligning with them.
Well, and there's different references throughout the poem where somebody says, Ajax says, it's clear that you have the gods with you. I would be foolish to fight you.
Yes, right.
Hector actually recognizes that with Achilles, but then Athena comes in and tricks him, right? So yeah, that gets to sort of a central feature, which is it's fatalistic, right? There's not much anybody can do. These fates have been determined. And so you're acting out your fates. You're trying to do it best as you can. And you don't know to what degree your agency will make a difference.
Yes, right.
Right. You don't know. And they're expressing this all through the poem. So it starts out, and as we said, the Greeks are fighting amongst themselves, but then they really kind of have the day. And there's a great scene where Diomedes and Odysseus, urge the Greeks on. But then the next day, the Trojans come back, and it looks really bad. They get really close to the Greek ship. But eventually Patroclus, Achilles' dear friend of his heart, goes forth and turns the tide, but then he's killed. And,
yes,
it's sort of the crux of the poem. So Achilles comes out of his rage. I was really struck this time by reading Achilles saying, "It was so stupid to get so mad. I get so mad." And then Agamemnon eventually recants, and he says, "Oh my gosh, I was deluded. I shouldn't have done that. I was deluded," which, it's shown that like the gods kind of come over him and cloud his judgment.
Yeah.
So they make peace, and Achilles vanquishes Hector. And it's so brutal. And then he drags Hector's body, and then he tries to practice every imaginable desecration to Hector's body.
Yeah.
He's prevented. And then probably my favorite moment of the poem comes when Priam comes to Achilles and begs him for the body of his son. And Achilles recognizes the valiant nature of Hector, even though he hates him because he killed. And he recognizes the love of Priam. And he then is recalled to his own father, Peleus, who will die without him back. And they cry together and they mourn their dead. And it's so moving, isn't it?
It is. It's so moving.
It's so moving.
Part of the reason that the Iliad is so powerful is because its structure is excellent. Meaning, we learn early on that we're headed toward a conflict between two seemingly indomitable warriors in Hector and in Achilles, right? Like we get closer and closer and closer to that conflict. And I remember, if you don't know the Iliad, I remember going into that conflict thinking, I don't know who's going to win this. Like these are two complete warrior studs, and who's going to win? And it's part of what makes Hector's death so poignant is that he is great. He is great. It's not Achilles didn't, right? It's not that Achilles picked on some runt without any sort of like deep moral fiber. No, Hector is great in like all of the lights that we would judge greatness. And so it pains us when Hector dies. And to see him dragged outside the city gates in that fashion is such an abomination that it hurts even more.
I've got a great quote from Simone Weil, who wrote a really interesting and provocative essay on the Iliad, but she writes, "Thus, violence obliterates anybody who feels its touch. It comes to seem just as external to its employer as to its victim. And from this springs the idea of a destiny before which executioner and victim stand equally innocent, before which conquered and conqueror are brothers in the same distress. The conqueror brings misfortune to the conqueror, and vice versa. There are heroes on both sides, and both fall by the sword." So, isn't that powerful?
It's really powerful. I want to spell Simone Weil's last name because if you don't know the name, it'd be hard to find. W-E-I-L?
Mm-hmm. And we can put a link to it in our show notes.
Yeah.
Because you can easily access this. Her essay is called the Poem of Force, and it just talks about how power dehumanizes the other. It makes it is the driving power corrupts both. So in this, I think, why is this book remembered? And more specifically, what do we learn about war? Because there we go. that's the end, right? Hector's funeral is the end of the Iliad. Now, oftentimes people think that it ends with the Trojan horse, but it doesn't. Like, it ends at Hector's funeral.
Right. The Trojan horse makes no appearance in the Iliad.
Yeah, it's not there.
Which is really fascinating because that's something that people remember probably more than anything else about this conflict, and it doesn't show up in its most famous poem. It shows up in Virgil's Aeneid, and it shows up in other places in the ancient record, but not in the Iliad.
Not in the Iliad. So don't be looking for it. Actually, when Mark got to the end, he was like, "Wait, where's the horse?" I feel gypped.
Right.
Anyway, coming back, what do we learn about war? Well, I think the Iliad, well, we can talk about the ways the Iliad has been used through history, but to me, it shows that conflict, just like Simone Weil wrote, there's a democratization in conflict, like everybody's affected. So this is not between two, like a good guy and a bad guy. What's so interesting in the poem is both sides are represented as valiant, as heroic, as great. You know, they're both represented as retaining those qualities. Conflict is also not just between bitter enemies. The Trojans and the Greeks are bitter enemies, but there is conflict between the sides, kind of what you pointed to already.
Yeah.
Got Agamemnon and Achilles. We've got Paris and his family. I mean, Paris's family is not big on Paris because Paris is kind of a loser. Yeah. We have, how about Cassandra and the Trojans? Cassandra is the woman fated to be right, but nobody to listen to her. We have conflict in heaven. In the poem, Hera tricks Zeus into going to sleep in order for her to come down and help the Greeks, right? No. Fighting amongst the gods. So there's a lot of conflict, but it's not in only a good and a bad. There's not a good and a bad in this.
I like that you described it as kind of war democratizes because all participants are kind of put on a level. I don't mean that's the wrong way of saying it. There is so much respect between adversaries. Yeah. And I think it is because death is sort of democratizing everybody. Like, you're constantly facing the prospect of your own demise. I know that you have a hot take. I would love to just say one more thing, kind of looking way forward this season. I remember my dad saying to me that the American Civil War was one of the last, I can't remember exactly how he said it, like gentlemanly wars. Mm-hmm. And I remember he said that when I was a young man. I remember just thinking, like, what are you talking about, Dad? Like, all war is like brutal and there's nothing gentlemanly about it. But I think this is what I asked him to explain. Yeah. And he said, this is one of the last wars, the American Civil War, where you could look across the battlefield and actually see your opponent's eyes. Yes. And kind of know him as a man. And this is absolutely the case in the Iliad. Like, the fighting is done at sword length, at spear length, occasionally at arrow's length. Right. Yes. And so you know your opponent so deeply. You're looking at his eyes. Sorry, I keep going.
No, I was thinking of that exactly. I was like, this is not the right way to say it. But in some aspects, this is more humane war than what we see today.
Yes, right.
It's actually one of the ways in which this poem has been misused. It was used a lot before World War I, for sure, in the British public school system, where the glory of war was triumphed, you know? But when the soldiers got to the front, that is not what they experienced. They experienced being down by
machine guns from concrete nests, and they never saw the person who was doing it.
I mean, even if you think back to the invention of the bow and arrow, there is something about person-to-person meeting in this face-to-face way, right? The bloodiness that can sometimes be shocking, but it's also appropriate because it is shocking.
It does.
Another thing that we learn, and it's just what we described at the beginning, is that war is intoxicating.
Yes.
There's no other way to say it.
Yeah.
I have this great quote. Can I read it to you?
Yeah.
Vera Brittain, and this is around World War I, and she says this about war. She says, this glamour, this magic, this incomparable keying up of the spirit in a time of mortal conflict is what constitutes the pacifist's real problem. Honor is dishonest, but the challenge to spiritual endurance, the intense sharpening of all the senses, the vitalizing consciousness of common peril for a common end remain to allure young people. The glamour may be short-lived, but while it lasts, no emotion known to man seems as yet to have quite the compelling power of this enlarged vitality. So, I mean, I think that the Iliad gives that to us, right? I mean, when Hector is urging his troops onto battle, there's something that rises up and says, I want to join. I want to join.
Yeah, right.
When it's going bad, and then Ajax comes and plants his shield around Patroclus's body and says, you will not have this body. You feel the greatness of it, right? You feel the intensity and the vitality like she's talking about.
Walker Percy, who I'm going to quote from in our next episode on the book of Judges from the Old Testament, Walker Percy has this essay in which he kind of asks rhetorically, why was my grandfather never happier than the day that he heard we were going to fight the Germans?
Yeah.
Right? There's something about war that for his grandfather was so appealing and intoxicating.
Yes.
Like a shortened version of the quote that you just shared.
Yes. Another great scholar talks about this as well, and he says, culture that created the Iliad, recited it with its war heroes, was a culture that understood the moral harm of war. He says that Achilles becomes, at one point, a berserker. He is intoxicated with war. He is drunk with blood. But what he gets there is that it's an ecstatic experience. So Timothy Keatsis, the scholar, says, what is the opposite of war? What would you say the opposite of war is?
Peace?
It's not peace. He says the opposite of war is liturgy, because you need something as powerful. Cuts off communion, right? It cuts off communion. It cuts off the sense of a shared life together. And he says you need something that equally reintegrates. So he says that this was a liturgical practice for returning war veterans in ancient Greece.
Wow, really?
Of the Iliad was a liturgical practice that reincorporated those soldiers back into the community.
Oh my gosh. That is so powerful.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
And now, as we've discussed this whole thing, you understand why. Because if you've been a killer, even if you have survived, there is a harm that has been done to you.
Right.
And the opposite of war is not peace. The opposite of war is liturgy. So how about we end there?
That, I think, Emily, that was your hot take. The opposite of war is not peace.
Right. Should we go back?
It's liturgy.
We should go back.
No, here's what we do. I think we're just candid with our audience. This is Hot Takes on the Classics, and we have planned to have a sort of unique take on some aspect of the book that we're reading. And we even had like a little musical bumper that we had planned. But I think, Emily, you got to your hot take. You got to your hot take without labeling it.
Okay, great. I had another hot take, but we'll go with that as my hot take.
I love it. Hey, we are trying to keep our episodes somewhat thrifty. We're thinking of the parent, the adult who's driving to and from work, and we're thinking 20 minutes to work, 20 minutes home. If you don't live in a major city, something like that. That's kind of our goal. Yeah, I know. I live in Atlanta, and there's no way 20 minutes to work is a reality. But that's at least our little fiction. Try to keep the this podcast at a reasonable length. We thank you so much for joining us for episode 1, season 1 on Homer's Iliad. Please tune in to our next episode on the book of Judges from the Old Testament. We'll see you then. Okay, that's our show for today. Thanks to a few people, Clark Stefanik, our producer. Thanks to True North platforms this podcast. And if you like this show, you might like the Classical U podcast or the Chris Perrin podcast, check them out on the True North platform. Also, thanks to Tom Hagerman, who wrote and performed our music.